Sergei Lavrov, the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, gave what is for me probably the most Orwellian interview that I've sat through in a long while. He did this interview with the BBC journalist Steven Rosenberg. It was about a week ago. It is day 125 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Although, as you'll see in this interview, Lavrov's claiming it's not actually a Russian invasion. So let's get into it and react to a few choice clips. I'll link the full interview down below. It's about, I think it's over 30 minutes long. And first of all, I want you to think a little bit about why is Sergei Lavrov doing this interview in the first place? And he did it, I think, around the same time as Russia banned many Western journalists, including those from the BBC. And Steven Rosenberg is this long-standing, esteemed BBC journalist with respect to Russia. He's like their man in Moscow. Why would he want to go on and give this interview at this time? I guess it was shot sometime, can't tell the exact date, maybe around 110, after day 100 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So let's just go and have a look at a few choice clips from it.
Перед тем, как президент Путин принял решение и объявил о начале специальной военной операции, как он ее называет, он посоветовался у вас, стоит ли это делать или нет?
Стивен, вы очень опытный журналист, хорошо знакомы с реалиями и в России, и вокруг России, на постсоветском пространстве. У вас в этом вопросе звучит желание отменить все, cancel culture, отменить все, что было до 24 февраля.
Нет, я просто хотел уточнить.
So there, I think the very first interesting thing is Lavrov uses this term cancel culture. Now, for me and you, that means like trying to cancel someone who has another point of view that's not considered mainstream or socially acceptable. But actually the question he was asked is like, what was your role in deciding whether to invade or not? It's got absolutely nothing to do with cancel culture. And this is very strange out of context. He even said it in English. So this is maybe part of, the agenda that Lavrov has by giving the interview. He wants to talk about cancel culture for some reason, but it makes no sense in the context of the question he was asked. But, diplomats are a bit like politicians in that sense. They have a certain, they want to talk about everything except for the question they were asked. They want to basically answer the question they had wished they'd been asked, which is kind of why it makes no sense in this. But anyways, I found it a bit amusing that he started talking about cancel culture kind of out of nowhere to start the interview off.
Если цель защита русских на Донбассе, да, то почему за эти 4 месяца после начала специальной военной операции погибло больше мирных жителей на территории так называемой ДНР, ЛНР, чем за весь прошлый год?
So there, Rosenberg asked him a very pertinent questions that, well, if one of Russia's casus belli, which reasons for war, is to protect the people of Donbass, because if you go back, Russia, Putin, the president, in his speech 2 days before they launched this invasion on February 24, claimed that there was a genocide taking place in Donbass, that Ukrainians were committing a genocide against what he called, I guess, Russians there. But then he gets this question, well, why are you killing so many people in this region? You, Russia, if you claim you're there to protect the people, way more than the Ukrainians were killing. Allegedly, even, the Ukrainians were killing.
Вы тоже смотрели, наверное, репортажи немецкого телевидения, АРД, и французского канала основного, которые тут на днях заявили, что в результате бомбардировок со стороны российских вооруженных сил был атакован родильный дом в Донецке, рынок, где были убиты десятки мирных жителей. Они сказали, что это российские военные сделали. Ничтоже сумняшися, так же, как они в свое время, когда был удар по вокзалу в Краматорске, заявили, что это сделала Россия.
There you see, he just ignores the question, answers another a question he wished had been asked, because that's an uncomfortable one. He doesn't really have an answer for it. And there, you notice he said Western journalists. They're all journalists that either work for Russia Today, again, complaining earlier about his cancel culture, that they're not appearing on the West anymore, or there are other journalists, well, you can call them journalists, but basically they're there to pirate Russian propaganda, right? So they're journalists that may be originally from the West, but basically they're spending all their time in these Russian-controlled areas and basically saying the same thing more or less as Russia today would say, Russian state propaganda.
Объясните мне, пожалуйста, одну вещь. В прошлом году на территории ЛНР, ДНР погибло 8 мирных жителей. В позапрошлом году погибло 7 мирных жителей. Одна смерть – это трагедия.
Безусловно.
Но это не геноцид, о котором часто говорят чиновники в России. Вот объясните мне, пожалуйста, учитывая эти цифры, как вы можете сказать, что это разумное решение было вторгаться в Украину?
So then Rosenberg asked him a second time the question, basically in other words. He says basically 15 civilians died in the previous 2 years, so how can you justify launching this invasion? Obviously, has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, if not 100,000 already.
Знаете, мы не вторгались в Украину. Мы объявили специальную военную операцию.
Here it gets really Orwellian. Lavrov claims that Russia didn't invade Ukraine. He's actually said this before outside of the interview, so let's see how he tries to justify it.
Когда у нас уже не осталось никакого способа объяснить Западу, что он занимается преступной деятельностью, втягивая Украину в НАТО, лелея и опекая и всячески пестуя откровенно неонацистский режим.
Then he incredibly says this part of the sentence, that dragging Ukraine into NATO was a criminal act. So it's not illegal for Ukraine to join NATO, as in the same way it wouldn't be illegal for them to join CSTO, which is Russia's rival security organization, to NATO. And they weren't been dragged in like Ukraine wanted to join, at least its government did. And now definitely in the opinion polls after Russia did this latest invasion, the majority of people want to be in NATO so they don't get bombed and killed by Russia. Yeah, it's just like Orwellian, as I said, like, first of all, we didn't invade. It's a criminal act. It's just like complete rubbish. It's just interesting for a guy who's been a diplomat for as long as Sergei Lavrov, who's, I guess, held by many people in high esteem. And I know he's a diplomat, he has to basically defend his country's interests and toe the official line, but this is just bizarre to listen to. And he says the West was supporting nurturing an openly neo-Nazi regime. So now he's calling the government of the Ukrainian government with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president, as openly neo-Nazi. I mean, first of all, it's hilarious that he said openly neo-Nazi. Well, you might claim that they're secretly neo-Nazi and it'd still be BS, but to call them openly neo-Nazi, the government, again, the far right in Ukraine got 3% in the last elections. Zelensky got 73% of the vote. He's Jewish. He's actually a Russian speaker. So according to Lavrov and the Russian side, he'd be a Russian by their logic. And his grandparents, his grandfather, I think, was in the Red Army fighting against the Nazis, and some of his own family members were killed in the Holocaust. And this is just a kind of reiteration of Russian propaganda line that there's a neo-Nazi coup. And interesting, which goes to why Lavrov may have given this interview, about a week prior to this, Putin, when he was giving a talk to some students in Russia, he let it slip. He basically compared himself to Peter the Great, and he was like, we're just doing what Peter the Great did. We're just taking back land that's ours. So it's basically imperialism, right? So just interesting that after Putin dropping all these pretenses about biolabs or NATO expansion or the Nazis or the people of Donbass that we hear so much about now, Russia is killing so many of them, that he goes back to these lines straight away.
Давайте посмотрим последствия. Вот прошло 4 месяца, да? Итог.
Итог.
Тысячи мирных жителей погибло, более 14 миллионов украинцев вынуждены были покинуть свои дома, значительные потери российских войск, куча санкций против России. Вы до сих пор считаете, что это правильное решение было?
Я вам еще сказал, у нас не было иного выхода.
So there you see, after it's laid out and after 4 months of killing thousands of civilians, do you think it was worth it? Oh, we had no choice. I mean, it's again Orwellian. He had no choice now. I mean, obviously Russia decided to invade and kill all these people, right? As a consequence. But now they claim they have no choice. Hilarious. If it weren't so tragic.
То, что сейчас вашим оружием, западным оружием, украинский режим атакует мирных граждан.
So then he starts talking about the government in Kiev attacking civilians in the east of Ukraine. I mean, it was just pointed out that, well, 15 civilians died in the previous 2 years. How many tens of thousands of civilians? By the way, mainly Russian-speaking civilians have his government killed in the last 4 months. It's going to be like, who knows, 100 times higher, 1,000 times higher by the end. And the whole time when he's talking about the neo-Nazi battalions, he's talking about less than 1,000 soldiers, basically, in an army of a few 100,000. Again, it's, even you compare it to the Russian military with Wagner Group, who are mercenaries, whose founder, Utkin, is a neo-Nazi, and then members of his own government who've been Sieg-heiling Nazi salutes in the past and now have high esteemed positions similar to Lavrov in the government. It's a bit farcical. Again, Orwellian is the word that comes to mind.
Я вам объясняю, что украинский режим бомбит свое собственное население, а вы ему продаете оружие, чтобы он продолжал это делать. А насчет геноцида, вот вы англичанин?
Англичанин.
Представьте себе, если бы в Ирландии, не в Северной Ирландии, а в Ирландской республике, запретили английский язык. Как бы себя англичане ощущали?
So now we get into, for me, I think personally, one of the weirdest parts of this interview, because I'm sitting here, the sun has just gone behind the clouds, on the west coast of Ireland, right? The Republic of Ireland, which is obviously where Lavrov is referring to. And he says, well, how would you feel as an Englishman if they banned the English language? Obviously, here in Ireland, everybody speaks English. We have Irish as well, which is the official language of the country. And then he's asked, well, how would you feel if they banned it?
Но точно не вторгались бы в Ирландию. И,
Нет,
кстати,
подождите,
русский язык не
это
запрещен.
вас не унижало бы?
And then Rosen said, well, we wouldn't invade, which is presumably the case. If for some reason the Irish government decided to ban the English language, what business is it of the United Kingdom if Ireland bans English, which, well, they're not going to do anyways, nor has Ukraine done. The Russian language is not banned in Ukraine, it's just not an official language.
Язык не запрещен.
Это вас не унижало бы? Русский язык запрещен на Украине.
It's just such a weird thing to claim, right? So he makes this terrible comparison with the Republic of Ireland, and basically imagine if tomorrow Ireland said, you know what, English is no longer an official language, it's just going to be Irish from now on. What, Boris Johnson's going to roll the tanks out of Belfast and come down here and just start killing us to save the people who are English speaking? It's so ridiculous, the whole thing.
Что нельзя говорить на русском языке?
Попробуйте на улице в Киеве, когда там гуляют молодые люди определенной внешности, поговорить на русском языке. Попробуйте.
I mean, this is just so farcical. As a statement, he said, try to speak Russian in Ukraine, in Kiev, on the streets. Like probably at least half the population do on a daily basis, you mean, in a city of 4 million people? Yeah, there are too many people probably doing that as he says this. Well, probably not because so many of the residents had to flee as refugees because this individual terrorized them into leaving, right? So there's been how many millions of people who are displaced because of the conflict. Yeah, it's just completely bizarre. And actually, one of my friends who asked me to do this video, I talked to him and said, like, can Lavrov really sit there and say that you cannot speak Russian in Kiev and actually believe it? Well, I mean, it's so stupid, and that's the only word to describe it. It's just so patently stupid. What's going through his brain? I mean, is it just like, who is this aimed for as propaganda? It's just like so ridiculous. And my friend said, well, maybe he just doesn't really know what goes on in Kiev. Like maybe just people tell him in his entourage that, oh, if you try to speak Russian in Kiev, they come and they beat you up on the street, there's like pogroms everywhere of the Russian speakers, and he really doesn't know. And I'm just like, my reaction to that would be BS. There's no way he could be that naive, right? The one thing I wouldn't call Sergei Lavrov is naive or stupid, malevolent, for sure, Machiavellian, 100%. So he must just know that that's not true what he's saying. It's just so preposterous, right? I know he can't just fly into Kiev. I mean, that was probably his plan, was to fly into Kiev or be flown in on a chopper and walk down Khreshchatyk, the main thoroughfare, and scream and shout about his glorious victory, the glorious victory of the Russian army through Kiev, and that was probably planned for at least 100 days ago. But seeing that he can't go there himself, how could he possibly believe this? It's just too stupid to imagine. It's a bit like, if you're from America, saying that, like a Mexican politician saying, well, try to speak in Spanish on the streets of yeah, Miami. And you'd be like, huh? You mean like, I don't know how many people speak Spanish in Miami, but it's a lot of people. I've been there. I actually went to parts where no one spoke English, in fact, and you were better received when you spoke in Spanish. But anyways, it's that stupid a statement.
Вы же у вас вот вся ваша аналитика опирается на ту самую cancel culture, культура отмены. Вы отменяете все, что предшествовало тому событию, которое вы решаете назвать то вторжением, то аннексией.
Нет, абсолютно
Как
нет.
So there again, he uses the term cancel culture, and he says it when he's speaking Russian in English, to say that, well, you're just canceling everything that happened before February 24, 2022. No, Russia was illegally occupying Crimea and parts of the Donbass. What do you think? It's through proxies, through these separatists, or the Russian troops are just there? But basically, no one's ignoring that, and Russia started a war that killed 14,000 people, 3,000 to 4,000 of those being civilians in Donbass. And yeah, they also had the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner by Russia. That's what an international investigation found. So yeah, there's no cancel culture. That's all part of the problem, Russia's behavior before this invasion. I just find it interesting that he really, really wanted to use this term cancel culture. So it's again goes back to why did he decide to do this interview, this bizarre interview, from point of view of someone like me, right, who doesn't support his invasion and him killing tens of thousands of people, not him, but Russia killing tens of thousands of people. Why use this word cancel culture? It's like clear he really wanted to use it, even seeing that he says it in English so often. So he's trying to hit a certain target demographic that Russia today can't reach at the moment.
Послушайте, что говорит Верховный комиссар ООН по правам человека. Она недавно, в мае выступала, да, и в том числе, это по итогам мониторинговой миссии, она сказала, в селе Ягодное Черниговской области российской военной 28 дней удерживали 360 человек, в том числе 74 ребенка и 5 людей с инвалидностью в подвале школы, без туалета, без воды. 10 пожилых людей умерли. Это борьба с нацизмом?
Знаете, к сожалению, и международные чиновники, включая Верховного комиссара по правам человека, включая, к огромному моему сожалению, генерального секретаря ООН и многих других представителей Организации Объединенных Наций, подвержены давлению Запада.
So then he accuses even the UN of spreading fake news, everything is fake, Russia never did anything.
И очень часто выступают рупором тех фейковых новостей, которые распространяет Запад.
То есть, получается, опять Россия белая пушистая, да? То есть...
Нет, Россия не белая, не пушистая. Россия такая, какая она есть. И мы не стыдимся показывать себя такими, какими мы есть.
So that must have been the most quoted phrase from this interview, because he, on the one hand, he denies all these war crimes, and then he says, yeah, we're not squeaky clean, we're showing who we really are. Like war criminals, right? I mean, just yesterday when I'm shooting this, you had an attack in Kremenchuk. The shopping mall, the main one in the city, was destroyed. And so far, as when I'm speaking to you, they're saying there's 18 civilian deaths. And I think there's another 20 or 30 people still missing, presumed dead. Maybe hopefully they find some survivors underneath. And of course, Russia does the same thing. You know, it just denies it's all fake. Oh, or they normally do it in two ways, actually. They say it's fake, and there's another kind of bizarre explanation for it, right? So they said it's fake, it's all this fake news. And then they said, yeah, we were actually hitting another building nearby, and then they got called fire, and basically that is collateral damage, right? So they do the same things from the official Russian representatives, right? There's no need for logic. It's Orwellian again. But think about it, yesterday, and they also killed civilians in Kharkiv in shelling, civilian areas. Just on a daily basis, they seem to kill more civilians in Ukraine than they accuse Ukraine of killing in the previous 2 years. So remember that 15 civilian dead figure from the previous 2 years that they call a genocide. They do that on a daily basis. Yeah, then they just say, hey, well, yeah, fake news. But we're going to show you who we really are. I mean, it's just like, I don't get it. Maybe I'm obviously not the target of this interview.
Я хочу вас спросить, ваш президент недавно очень хвалил Петра Великого, да, за то, что тот якобы возвращал территории, которые исконно русские, да, и он даже добавил, на нашу долю тоже выпало возвращать и укреплять. Вот я хочу вас спросить, сколько еще территорий, какие территории вы собираетесь возвращать?
I think this is probably the most important question in the interview, because Putin, as I said, gave this talk to some students in, I think it was St. Petersburg, I don't remember where the students were, but and he basically just let the cat out of the bag. Hey, это империализм, детка. Now I'm paraphrasing. He didn't actually say it's imperialism, baby, but he said, hey, it's just like back in the days of Peter the Great Northern War in the 18th century, and we're just taking back what's ours, right? So he asked the pertinent question, well, since Putin says this, where else are you planning to take back?
Во-первых, президент все сказал, мне тут добавить нечего. А во-вторых, я вам еще раз скажу, вы пытаетесь забывать все, что предшествовало.
And there he says, yeah, the president said everything. Oh yeah, so basically you are planning to like have a war of imperialism until basically you're defeated? Is that the point?
Я в будущее посмотрю, Сергей Викторович.
Нет, я вам говорю, вы отрицаете, отменяете, вы не хотите слышать.
He uses the word cancel again, right? We're asking you, where else are you planning to invade, Lavrov? Oh, let's talk about before the war, Nazis, NATO expansion, the people of Donbass. Crocodile tears again from this reprehensible individual. Like, what happened before, Lavrov? In another country, there was a change of government. You might like it, I understand. The previous leader was more friendly since he fled to Moscow along with his entourage with stolen billions of euros from the Ukrainian people. But yeah, it's not your country, but that's the whole problem with this imperial war. The Russians, let's go and see what else he says. That's just fucking bizarre.
Я хочу вас спросить по поводу британцев, которые недавно были приговорены к смертной казни. Поэтому в глазах Запада Россия несет ответственность за судьбу этих людей. Вы не считаете, что этот смертный приговор...
Меня глаза Запада не интересуют вообще.
So then Rosenberg asked him a question about 2 British prisoners of war who were in the Ukrainian armed forces, and basically the Russian side planned to execute them. They'd said before not before the invasion, but once the invasion started, that they would consider any foreigners fighting in the Ukrainian army, regardless if they have Ukrainian citizenship or if they're part of the regular armed forces of Ukraine, that we're just going to consider them mercenaries and we're going to execute them, basically. So yeah, due process, first of all, to understand, if you're in the armed forces of the country that's a participant in the war, then you're not a mercenary. You actually have to be paid significantly more than a soldier. You have to basically arrive and then be paid a lot more, to simplify it into kind of more layman terms, which doesn't apply to either of these prisoners from what we can see. So treating them, so this what's called the Geneva Conventions, right, that deals with prisoners of war in a conflict such as the one in Ukraine, and basically you can't just go and execute them, right? This is the whole point. But let's see how Lavrov responds.
Меня интересует только международное право. По международному праву наемники не являются комбатантами.
So Lavrov just says, yeah, they're mercenaries. So under international law, they don't have protection of the Geneva Conventions. But I mean, a court would have to decide that, first of all, not just Lavrov. So he's just predetermined what the outcome is.
Что у вас в глазах, откровенно говоря, не имеет значения.
He says whatever you think is honest is kind of irrelevant, i.e. Russia has captured them, is just basically going to do what it wants to them regardless of international law. It's pretty vile, this the way he's talking about 2 soldiers.
Не наемники, они служили в украинских вооруженных
Это
силах.
должен определить суд.
Now Lavrov decides, it has to be decided by a court.
А вы считаете, что там независимый суд?
Я убежден, что там независимый суд. А вы считаете...
This whole Donetsk People's Republic, Luhansk People's, is not a real thing legally. Does anyone other than Russia actually even recognize it? It's not internationally recognized anyway. So, that's just a kangaroo court in international law terms, and ultimately Russia is responsible for this. So, if they are executed, murdered, basically, then Russia is responsible under international law.
Вы критикуете страны, как Великобритания, да, которые поставляют оружие Киеву, да? Но кто больше виноват в этом? То есть страны, которые поставляют оружие стране, которая защищает свою землю, Украина, или страна, которая напала на Украину?
I have to give credit for Rosenberg here for at least asking, pertinent questions like, which is worse, invading a country or supplying weapons to a country to defend itself?
Как она защищает свою землю, когда она бомбит своих граждан? Я вам еще раз напоминаю, Зеленский в сентябре сказал, кто хочет думать по-русски и считает себя русским, пусть проваливает в Россию. Почему вы об этом не говорите? Почему вы забываете про предшествующие события? А сейчас, когда они бомбят свои собственные города, населенные пункты, рынки, родильные дома,
Well, he's basically giving a list of places that Russia has blown up since they. He said, let's only talk about before we invaded, or this part of the invasion, because they invaded in 2014 anyway. So
Я здесь почти 30 лет в России, да, я объехал страну. И в селах, в городах, где я побывал, знаете, какую фразу я слышал чаще всего? Лишь бы не было войны. Лишь бы не было войны. Я понимаю, что ваша страна пострадала от войны, ужасно пострадала. И поэтому не укладывается в голове, что ваша страна завязала войну против Украины и начала войну в Европе. Я не понимаю, почему. Вот зачем это нужно было, чтобы погубить Украину и будущее вашей страны?
So this is kind of the final question that I'm going to react to in the interview. He says, well, you know, there's this saying in Russia that we mustn't have war, so how can you do this? How can you launch the biggest war in Europe since World War II on such spurious grounds?
Я услышал вас, да. А у вас укладывается в голове тот политический курс, который Киев проводил последние 10 лет, на отмену всего русского? Укладывается в голове? Вы считаете, что если не будет, лишь бы не было войны, означает унижение, возможность унижения русских, России?
So this is an interesting casus belli that he gives, which is basically, you think Russia can be humiliated? That's basically, imagine we had that as a, as a legal standard. I feel humiliated. Why are you humiliated? It's not relevant. It's like an SJW, right? A social justice warrior. They feel outraged and offended by something, now they're going to come and attack you. That's basically what he is. He's super woke, actually, in fact, Mr. Lavrov here.
Как об этом вот говорит министр иностранных дел Чехии, отвечая Макрону, который призывает не унижать русских. Об этом-то почему-то никто не разговаривает.
So far, into his response, the excuse he's given for starting the war is, we felt humiliated.
Лишь бы не было войны. Да, это фраза, которая глубоко укоренена в русском народе. Но в русском народе также укоренена еще, знаете, гордость, то, что мы называем национальной гордостью, чувством собственного достоинства, которого пытаются лишить всех русских на Украине при вашей поддержке.
Which the Ukrainians are taking away from them. And how are they taking it away from Russia? Because Ukraine is independent and it doesn't want to be with Russia. It's really that simple. I mean, he's just like, I mean, look at the guy. He's like, I will say, I don't know how old is he. He's in his 70s at this stage, but like Putin. It's like the whole entourage around him is basically old dudes, grandpas, right, dedushki. And they're basically bitter that they don't have the same value as they did before. Like, there's a reason, a very good reason, why Ukraine doesn't want to be with Russia, why it wants to be independent and forge its own path westwards. It's like hanging out in Russia didn't work out with them very well since independence, because they were, in the beginning at least, more aligned with Russia. And they ended up poor. Look at their GDP per capita versus the countries that joined the European Union, went west earlier, like Poland or Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia. They have a GDP per capita that's 4 times higher than Ukraine and twice that of Russia, and even higher than Moscow Oblast, right? So the richest part of Russia in GDP per capita is poorer than Poland or the Baltic states. Just think of that, with all the resources that they're pulling in from all the regions in Russia, funneling it all into Moscow, still poorer than Estonia. And that's actually, I referred to that in the video I did before this invasion back in December. It was in Kharkiv. I'll link it up in the card down below in the description. It's the promise of prosperity that is driving Ukrainians to join the West. And there's a lot of other things that come with that, like rule of law, more democracy than they have currently or had since independence. And Russia just says you don't have a right to do that, right? It's realpolitik, like we're just going to invade you to stop it because we feel humiliated according to Lavrov here. But he's basically a low-value guy. That's what the bottom line it is. If Russia actually had an inspiring country that, you know, provided a superior standard of living, more freedoms than, say, the European Union did or the West did in general, then Ukraine would want to be with Russia, probably, on average, right? But they don't want to be with Russia because Russia is basically offering them a really poor deal by hanging out with them. And this is what low-value bullies do, right? They come and they harass their ex-girlfriend and stuff, saying, you have no right to go off that other guy, you're mine. So this is basically the mentality.
Вот и все.
That's it. Like basically, we feel humiliated that Ukraine want to leave us, so now we're going to kill them. Basically, yeah, it's ours because Russians, we can't be humiliated. I mean, the guy's super woke, basically. Ironically, for a guy talking about cancel culture, that's my reaction. You should go and watch the full interview. It is kind of weirdly amusing, if it weren't so tragic, kind of situation to watch it. Again, write me down below why you think he agreed to do the interview. For me, it doesn't really make much sense. I watch it, I just think Lavrov is basically humiliating himself by doing the interview because he just sounds like a bumbling idiot. What I'm seeing is that he agreed to go on mainstream media, BBC, even though they're banning other BBC journalists from coming to Russia because they don't have access to the mainstream. That can be the only reason. And then he basically repeated the main talking points that these other people also just mentioned, you know, kind of ad nauseum. And also, I think, since he completely avoided the question when he was asked about Putin's Peter the Great wannabe little talk that he had with those Russian students, he kind of let the cat out of the bag, as I said. And I actually went to all of those alternative commentators, looked through all of them, many of the people I've reacted to over the last 3 months of the war, and not one of them could I see, anyways, even mentioned that talk. And it's just so, like this most obvious thing that this is all about imperialism. Again, we go back to Putin's speech 2 days before the war. He started off the speech with Ukraine is not allowed to leave Russia's sphere of influence. He used the word inalienable, right? It means you cannot separate it. And then he said, second point, Ukraine's borders are legitimate. That's all you really need to know. The rest of it is just like really lame casus belli. They feel humiliated that Ukraine doesn't want to be with them. Nice, Lavrov. Anyways, I think, yeah, let's see what happens to people like Sergei Lavrov once this war is over and Ukraine is victorious, because I called the war on day 30. I'll link that up above in the card down below in the description. So anyways, that's the video. It's a beautiful evening here on the west coast of Ireland. I'm looking forward to going back to free Ukraine, the 80% that Russia is not currently occupying illegally, in the next few weeks. So let me know down below in the comments what you think of Lavrov's interview, who you think he's trying to actually appeal to, whether it was successful, that demographic. Maybe you are from that demographic. Maybe you thought he crushed it. I did see one comment actually asking me to react to it from someone who thought he absolutely killed it. Oh, he showed that BBC journalist his place. Oh, with really intellectual, strong, cogent arguments. I don't know. But anyways, let me know. Slava Ukraini, Heroям Slava. Have a great evening wherever you are, morning or day. До побачення, до свидання. Ciao.
SAR Experience.